think about the way grades are set up and how they function in the classroom, it's mind-boggling that we haven't stopped to reconsider other options for this. It's just so entrenched in tradition and enculturated in our practices of school. Grades as they're set up currently are punitive in nature. Don't make any mistakes, which, by the way, screwing up and making mistakes is one of the best ways to learn, right? But you are disincentivized to screw up.
Hey, you found Ways We Learn, an investigation of how learning happens across all ages and modalities. Let's go learn something. Hi, and welcome back to Ways We Learn. I'm Sean, and I'm here with Joe, and we've got another fascinating guest for you today. Dr. Michael Kolodziej is the founder and lead nerd at Instructional DesigNerd, an independent learning, design, and innovation consultancy based in San Diego, California. He also serves as Director of Educational Program Development for University of Phoenix, developing a catalog of non-credit professional development courses to help learners advance their careers through certifications. And over the last 15 years, Michael has served in a variety of professional capacities in the field of learning, including being an instructor at the high school and college levels, a learning and development professional, a learning technologist, a learning designer, an innovator, and just an all-around learning nerd. And so he's my kind of person. Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us on Ways We Learn.
Awesome. It's so great to be here. Thank you, Sean.
Great to have you. So let's just start with your background and what brought you to the place of becoming the instructional design nerd.
If you polled my high school teachers, they would say I was the least likely to become any sort of nerd, nonetheless one that was in the field of education. I would always consider myself a smart kid who hated school. I was definitely someone that was not successful for or really happy in the school environment. It changed for me in college when I transferred into junior college. I barely made it into, I think, two of the first four classes I took were 50 level classes. So they weren't even 100 level. They weren't even really college level classes. I was so far behind. But I came to the realization that, wow, all of a sudden this matters. And the more you know, the more you can do in life and the more you can earn. And so I had a revelation in college that I'd better start playing the game and get serious, because my jokes weren't really going to get me too far in the back of my community college class. Somewhere in there, I really fell in love with the idea of knowledge and really the power that knowledge provides. And so, now I find myself, instead of being that goofball in the classroom, I'm working with schools to help design curriculum that better suits students like myself, and really that is more in line with what we know about the science of learning and how people learn. There's just so much that we do out of tradition and convention that is absolutely misaligned with what we know from the literature and from research. And so that's really my passion.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get there, can you describe what you do as an instructional design nerd?
Absolutely. Yes. Through my consulting business, I do a number of different things, from designing learning experiences for corporations and organizations, mostly in the virtual world and the online world, but some in person. And then do consulting for one of my favorite clients is a local charter high school, where I'm really involved in helping to design their school day and really interjecting what we know about learning to, the activities and practices that are occurring in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. It's super fun to have gone from the kid who was in the principal's office to now I'm in the principal's office, but they're paying me to tell them what they should do with their students. Kind of mind-blowing. It's my passion.
Yeah.
And, I strongly believe that school is misaligned to a lot of people. I think even in my own children, I see what going to a highly competitive, traditional academic school can do to a student's sense of self-worth and their self-confidence if they're not innately talented in the areas that they need to be in order to succeed. And
Mhm.
gosh, it's staggering to consider the aggregate amount of damage that poor pedagogy has had on learners
Seriously.
and will continue to have unless we do something about it.
It sounds like you're doing from K-12 all the way to adults and working learners. Do you have a space you think you spend most of your time?
I focus mostly on adults. The charter school is a high school, so 9 through 12, and that's kind of as young as I get. Many of the principles, though, I would argue are the same. We talk about pedagogy and andragogy, but at a certain point, there's certainly a lot of blending of those two ideas because we're all humans. My career has been largely focused on higher education and adult education.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I like how you're thinking about that because I've said the same thing to people that, andragogy is all about motivation and self-direction and interest and all of that stuff and feeling the sort of intrinsic motivation in the learning. And kids want that too. It's not just an adult thing.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
Yes,
there's a
that's a
lot of
human
crossover.
thing. Yeah,
Human
everyone
thing,
wants
exactly.
to be in control and to have meaning in the work that they do. And we just often think of children as sort of these beings that don't have the ability to guide their own interest in a positive way. And
Yeah.
with the right structure and the right encouragement, that is absolutely an achievable goal.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We did a podcast episode with one of the co-founders of Sora Schools, which is,
Yeah.
if anybody is listening to this, it might be a nice cross-reference for them, because their whole thing is about student choice and student interest in the learning, and it's a really powerful thing to provide. So, okay, you mentioned one of the things that is a problem with traditional school, which is the sort of self-worth that it can take away when someone doesn't fit into that mold. And you've felt that yourself. And you said as you were leading up to the instructional design nerd thing that you might be the least likely person, but I actually think that makes you probably the most likely person to look at how to change the experience because you experienced it so much and you didn't just fit into it. But what we're interested in talking about today is those things that don't help us learn, but we do anyway in traditional school. And then we'll flip that and talk about some of the things that actually do help us learn that we want to do in school. But before we get there, let's start with the things that don't help us learn. And you mentioned that value thing. I wonder if a place to start would be grades.
Grades. Yeah. Boy, get me started on grades. If you really think about the way grades are set up and how they function in the classroom, it's mind-boggling that we haven't stopped to reconsider other options for this. It's just so entrenched in tradition and enculturated in our practices of school. But grades as they're set up currently are punitive in nature, meaning you start with an A and you can only lose it, right? So
Work your way down.
so
Yeah.
don't screw up. Don't make any mistakes, which by the way,
hmm
screwing up and making mistakes is one of the best ways to learn,
Mhm.
right? But you are disincentivized to screw up. There's a high pressure to achieve a grade at any cost, which leads to
hmm
cheating, which leads
hmm
to, all sorts of academic dishonesty. It's fear-based, right? I don't want to lose my A. It can be very demoralizing. I love to contrast it with the idea of establishing a certain number of points at each grade level and allowing the learners to complete activities until they get the number of points that they want. So, maybe 1,000 points is an A and 900 is a B and so on and so forth, and providing them with opportunities to build from zero up to as high as they want to go.
You're thinking of like a mastery learning approach.
Yeah, like a mastery learning. I mean, you think
Yeah.
about, and this has happened to me multiple times as a high school student, my grades down to a C or D. Well, where's the motivation to
Right.
try to get it? I know I can't statistically get it back up to an A. So it's
hmm
demotivating, demoralizing, and completely unnecessary.
And not to mention that when that happens, your grade is a C. You see a C on the paper, you see a C on the report card. You start to identify as a C student, and it really starts to affect the way that you perform even outside of that experience in the next class or in another class that you're taking at the same time. I'm a C student. There's no way I should try for an A. And you see that start to play out. I've seen it play out in one of my kids that she was struggling in some areas of school and she just thought she was dumb. And it took a long time to really coach her and help her understand that's really not the case.
Why is that different in a world where you like? I love the idea that Mike put forward, which is you have this bar that you have to hit. It's whatever, 50 points. Each point is a hunk of knowledge.
A hunk of knowledge.
And your goal is
a hunk of burning knowledge.
Exactly. And your goal is to go past that 50 points. And you can hit 100, right? Maybe you're 100 in French because you're an expert, but you're 49 in English because you're not as good as English. By putting a number on it, don't we then still say, I'm just a 49 student because I can only ever achieve 49? I guess what's the cognitive or the psychological difference between ABCDF and 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's in the way that you structure it so that it's additive instead of an average. So the current grading, like the traditional grading system, is you got a 50 on this and you got a 0 on this, and now your grade's a 25. Whereas with a mastery learning approach, I don't know if that's exactly what you were thinking of, Michael, but with a mastery learning approach, it would be you need to get to 50. And you get to do things over and over until you get to 50. And if you want to stop at 45, you can. But everyone has the chance to get to 50 and become that 50 student if they want to. And it's not going to affect you if you get a 0 the first
Which
time.
effectively means it equally weights the work you do in the first half of the semester to the work you do in the second half. Because you can always, if you have a bad first half of the semester, you can always redeem yourself in the second half. Or in traditional grading, if you bomb the first 2 tests in the first semester, like it's done. You
cannot.
We see that with
might as well not show up.
Right, we see that with advisors, right? Which is like advisors, if they happen to catch that a student's doing poorly, they'll try and grab them before the dropout deadlines. Hey, to drop out, like that ship sailed.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
I think you phrased it exactly right, Sean. And I'm not even anti-ABCDF as a correspondence to those additive numbers. But I like the non-punitive. Okay, you didn't get the 50 points this time or the 10 points or whatever the denomination is, but you have more than one opportunity and more than one way perhaps to earn and to demonstrate proficiency.
Right.
And I mean, that's not to really discuss the fact that grading in and of itself is so nebulous, right? Some portion of it often is competency. Some portion of it is performance-based. What did you do? There's very little direct correlation to, you can have a straight A student that barely learned anything and a D or C student that learned a lot because of the dilution of what grading actually means by having so many factors.
Yeah, of course.
Right. There's also been some research that any numeric or letter grade it can detract from learning, and that pure feedback is, I'll try to find the article and put it in the episode notes, but that pure feedback is the most effective thing for promoting learning, and that pure feedback, feedback plus a grade, the person will actually not perform as well over time as if they had just gotten the pure feedback.
Yep.
So I think that, Michael, what you were describing is certainly a better situation. I would say, and I don't know that this has been decisively proven exactly, but I wonder if having a grade at all is the problem versus having an average grade versus an additive one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that takes it even a step further, which I like, and dives into the intrinsic and extrinsic motivational components of completing work, right?
Let's define that while we're on it. Can you just define those for us?
Intrinsic and extrinsic learning.
Yeah,
so intrinsic meaning your internal innate desire to accomplish something versus extrinsic meaning some sort of a reward grade, point, incentive that's placed upon you by an external force to get you to perform in a certain way. And we know that, preferably we would, and this is big in the learning sciences, which is the area of research that I focus mainly in, which is, self-interest is huge. And we want to try to align learning experiences with things that people are interested in. A study comes to mind, was published a few years ago, where this teacher took reading material that was related to a game, an online video game that a certain subset of male students were playing. And the level, the sort of lexile number of this particular gaming manual was orders of magnitude higher than they were performing at in the classroom. And yet, because there was an interest in the subject matter, they were able to not only understand, but improve their reading ability, because they weren't being asked to read Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, right? It was something that and it's mind boggling that we have to have a study like that to remind us that people will perform better on things that they are interested in. And school is largely based on this huge assumption that the subjects and the concepts and ideas that were defined hundreds of years ago as important matter to our students. And in many cases, they just don't. And so it's not surprising that people are disengaged, right?
Yeah. So many problems in there. All these things that we that don't help us learn, and we do anyway. So what else would you want to talk about here? What other things do you see happening in traditional education that you just cringe about?
Well, I'd say it's a perfect lead into the idea of lecture as teaching. I'm not opposed to a timely, contextualized, concise explanation of something at the point of need. Where I think we go wrong is in the general assumption that we can fill up a learner with all this information and give it to them in encyclopedic A to Z way, and expect them to be able to access that information and use it in the real world. One of my favorite learning scientists is Sasha Barab. He's a professor. He has a quote I'm going to read. It's a little long, but I really think it's worth it. He said, if one were to peruse the user manual for most popular video games, he would quickly be overwhelmed by the seemingly impenetrable technical terms and contextualized grammars. In fact, until one plays the game, the manual is arguably meaningless and certainly not engaging in itself. However, once one plays the game, the previously cryptic rule sets and reference dynamics become intelligible. Even more importantly, the manual becomes a resource or a tool for maximizing gameplay performance. In schools, however, children are handed the manual, but not shown the game. In fact, the context of schools engaging in the actual game is considered an enrichment activity, while the manual remains the true object of teaching and the target of testing. So this analogy,
great quote.
Right, that we tell them all the what, and we never give them a real opportunity to do the things that would make the what interesting. And we teach and test to the manual, and it's considered extracurricular when we go on a field trip, right? When they go do something in the real world, it's like once or twice a year. There's permission slips in a bus, and generally we're just trying to fill them up with this information that has very little meaning to them because they have no application. And we wonder why they're disengaged.
It reminds me what we used to do at Flatiron when we thought about lectures, which is lectures end up being a hype moment. It's not about here is how you define a variable in programming languages and all that stuff. No. You're gonna spend 30 minutes in a lecture just hyping up what we're about to teach you, because we have to make you understand why you care about this. right? Same thing you do in video games. Like my example for our curriculum writers was always in video games. It's like video games do this so well because you don't open. I think that's why a lot of people dislike board games because board games can't do this sometimes.
You have to read this rule.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But like a video game, you jump in, and if you're doing a flight simulator, they immediately put you in, and you're like in the coolest jet. You're like doing the coolest stuff. You're just, it's
Yeah.
awesome. And then over
Yeah.
time, they reveal the game to you. And I feel like so much of
Right.
education is like, let's start with the fundamentals.
Yeah.
And it turns out starting with the fundamentals is often a terrible advice. You have to cover them,
Yeah.
but you start with the exciting, look how cool this is. Share that excitement, and then you back into the fundamentals.
Yeah, because until you're trying to fly an airplane and crashing repeatedly, you might not really care about
Yeah.
Bernoulli's principle
Exactly.
or the
Right.
altimeter
Yeah.
or whatever, because there's an assumption of interest that just isn't there.
Yeah. It's hard because
the
the
other thing
teacher
that-
is super interested.
Right. And it's a demonstration of their expertise.
Yeah.
Right. And they
Right.
get to have the spotlight and again, explaining something to somebody in the context of need. So let's say it's a problem-based learning or a project-based learning formality or format. And they get to a sticking point and you can, at that moment of need, direct them to the information in a very concise way where it's desired. Awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to have them struggle at all points in learning, but learning begins with questions and curiosity, and lectures often don't begin with questions and curiosity. Not to mention just the technical problems with lecture, that memory, building schema, putting things in your long-term memory. You have to make connections with things you already know, and you have to kind of play with thoughts, right? We've all watched a TV show, and at the end of it, you heard everything, but you don't remember anything. You're not engaged, right? In a lecture, if you engage and you really start to think about something, the lecture has continued on. Now you've missed what they just said next. So if you do stop and take the time to build schema, you're off the train. And that's why you sort of fade in and out of lectures. If you're a thinker, like I'm sure we are, you can pay attention for a few minutes and then you really need time to like process that and connect it to what you already know. And unfortunately, lectures are sustained monologues where the speaker is assuming that everyone's just picking it up at the same speed.
That is the nice part of recorded lectures, right?
Yes.
Well, and I think there's an important distinction to be made here, because what you're speaking about, Michael, is the traditional lecture, right? The 60-minute, everyone's in a huge auditorium. And I don't hear you saying that there's necessarily a problem. And in fact, you said that you're on board with direct instruction,
Yes.
right? You need to know this thing. I'm going to tell you this thing. But I think the point that you're making is if we lead with the theory, if we lead with the manual, as Sasha Barab had in that quote, that we're actually, so much of what's being said isn't going to have a place to land. And that sort of takes us to constructivism and the schemas that you were talking about and Piaget and all of that stuff. If you're just taking in this information without the ability to make sense of it and to lock it in, it's going in one ear and out the other. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be delivering knowledge at some point. It means that we need to be really thoughtful about how and when we do that. Is that
absolutely? Yeah, it's hard to have questions when somebody tells you everything up front, right?
Right.
When we learn is when we have that curiosity about something and we don't understand how it works, and we want to understand how it works to accomplish some sort of the goal, even if that goal is just to be more knowledgeable. And Joe makes a good point about the recorded lectures, but I'd argue that it takes a lot of self-governance to stop a lecture and think about it and then play. I think most people probably just fade in and out the same way.
Through this,
the problem is our context for watching video, whatever, 80% of the video we watch is like, it's The Office on TV, it's Ted Lasso. It's a very passive experience. The idea that you're doing the same physical manifestation, but instead of it being like a relaxing after dinner thing, you have to be very engaged. I think it's really, really hard. I'm not great at watching lectures.
You know what I'm great at watching though, are TED Talk.
Yeah, because
There's something
they're
about
so
TED Talk.
entertaining. But you never have to apply really any of it, right?
Yeah, and usually there's some sort of a moment in the first few minutes of the conversation that grabs my attention,
Right. They do the
where
hype.
now I
Mhm.
do have interest, you know?
Mhm.
And it's self-selected, right? Like I'm not
Yeah.
trapped in a situation where I have to listen to every subject.
But you're completely right. They
Uh,
bring the hype. Bring the hype early.
yeah.
They like really get you like, you think 2 + 2 is 4? It's not. It's 5. And you're like, all right, I'm in.
You're like, yeah, explain that to me,
Yeah,
pants.
exactly.
Well, and it goes back to what you were saying with the assumption of interest. And Joe, I'm thinking about some of the stuff that we would train the teachers on at Flatiron, which was that you have to lead with a hook. You cannot assume that somebody just is there because they want to be there. They've got other things on their mind. They don't know why this thing is important. And the example I would always use is, this actually happened to me in high school classes, where the math teacher would say, okay, so yesterday we learned this. Today we're learning this because it's on the next page. Here we go. I have no reason to want to learn that based on that description. But if you can say learning this thing in calculus is going to be able to describe how this part of the world works, and you need this in order to apply it when you go to here, and putting it in that context and making, again, going back to the intrinsic motivation does build the interest. And that is the thing that the TED Talk really does. They start off really interesting and they hook you. And a lot of lecture doesn't. It's like, okay, going to tell you the next thing you need to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we know too that when you're exposed to information, just by virtue of the way the human mind works, right? We're continuously exposed to information. It's been said that more than being a remembering machine, we're a forgetting machine.
Mhm.
And the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, decades old research shows that one day from today, so tomorrow at this exact time, right, either at the time we're recording or the time somebody's listening, they'll remember about 55% of
That's
what
pretty
was
good.
discussed, right? And then the next day it's it's 38 or something, and then by the time it's 7 days, you're at around 10% of what you heard.
Yeah.
And so there's a trap that, it seems so logical. If I tell you, then you know. And that's just not the case. It's the case for
Mhm.
about 5 minutes and then progressively gets worse and worse.
What kind of things have you done to instill some of these concepts of reducing lectures, of you got to tell them 15 times before it gets in their brain, and those kind of stuff? How have you done that in the instructional design, knowing that you're not like, I bet you're a great teacher, but that's not your job. Your job is to enable other
Right.
teachers. How do you kind of translate those beliefs into materials, or I don't know, things that the teacher then works with to deliver?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot in school. I couldn't spend more than 10 minutes telling you all the math I know. Like you just spend
Right.
hours and hours of math instruction. So they're not going to remember it anyway, right? Like you feel like you're losing time by not trying to jam information in their heads, but it doesn't stick anyway. If we can get them solving real world problems, the idea that you're trying to accomplish a goal that matters to you is a game changer. So I
Yeah.
try to, as much as possible, encourage teachers to give their students ownership. And I think that makes a big difference. It's a hard problem to solve though. It really is, because so much of what we measure and so much of the expectations traditionally in a teaching and learning environment don't really provide for that. So you have to be willing to go outside the lines.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to do that within a traditional system. It's almost easier in some ways if you're able to build the new system that aligns with the learning theory, because so much of what is traditional education is based in the ways that people were educated over 100 years ago, before there really was learning theory. So
Right.
it becomes very hard to change things, to match what we now know when you're in that kind of system. So another big one that I think that we should definitely talk about is learning styles.
Yeah.
And this has always been a pet peeve of mine, thinking about learning styles, but I'm going to just stop talking about it and let you talk about why this is a problem in education.
Yeah. So when we first met, we had a nice little conversation on learning styles, and it got me all excited because you quoted Kirschner, and
Yeah,
as a complete learning design nerd, Kirschner is one of my favorites. But
he's amazing.
he published a paper called Do Learners Really Know Best? Urban Legends in Education, that
Uh-huh.
really was a very comprehensive evaluation of a number of popularly held educational beliefs, the learning style being one of them. And the literature just basically doesn't support learning styles. There's low reliability and repeat testing. So you take the test you take an assessment one day, you take it a year later. The internal reliability of the measures are low. The number of styles are large and growing. And, to quote him directly, he said, though it's very appealing, there's absolutely no solid evidence as such that learning styles exist, or that there is any benefit to adapting and designing education and instruction to these so-called styles. He quotes a number of studies. One shows that if I tell you that I'm a visual learner and you present things to me in a visual modality, I'll either do the same or worse than if you presented them to me in a different modality. Ultimately, learning styles was an educational, how best to describe it. It was a company's effort to penetrate the educational system and make money. That's ultimately just been debunked, right?
Yeah,
I
but
think
lives on.
it
Yeah.
lives on, and I can always tell who's really studied learning and who hasn't, but they're mentioning of how they respond to learning style. Now,
Mhm.
all that being said, multimodal, multinodal learning is superior, right? If I'm presenting things to you in multiple ways, it's likely that you're going to have a higher probability of comprehending and learning the thing that we're talking about. But it's specifically the idea that you would say, I'm an X type, I'm a tactile learner, I'm an audio learner, I'm a visual learner, that just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Right. Well, and it's also incredibly limiting for someone to think of themselves that way. There was actually one of the students at Flatiron that I spoke with at one point, who, I forget which style, she said that she was maybe visual. I'm a visual learner. I have to learn visually. And it's such a limitation on the way that you see yourself. And that's part of why
Yeah.
it bugs me so much when a teacher is then setting that limitation on their students and saying, okay, well, Joe is an auditory learner, so I'm going to need to teach Joe this way, and I'm going to tell Joe that he needs to learn this way. And it's what you said, that learning through multiple modalities is the most effective thing. The sort of famous example is you wouldn't teach someone how to navigate the New York City subway by telling them about it without showing them a map. They might prefer to hear you tell them about it, but it's going to be a lot more effective if you show them a map and if you actually have them navigate the subway, which would be the kinesthetic thing.
Yeah, and it's not to say that people don't have preferences, right? Like,
That's it. Yep.
I might
Yep.
have a preference for watching videos on YouTube to learn things quickly. Does that mean that that's the best way for me to learn? No, but oftentimes our preferences aren't what's best for us, right?
Right.
But
Yep.
there's an assumption there that in the context of learning styles that there is,
Yeah.
and there just really isn't. Yeah.
No, I'm glad you said it, because that's exactly it. That the preference is completely
Yeah.
real. People absolutely prefer a certain method of learning, but it is not necessarily the best thing. And that's the same thing with me. That if I get a new piece of software, I'm like, I'm going to use this thing, and then I always realize that I would have been better off if I had read the manual, and yet I still go and do it. And so I would be categorized as a kinesthetic learner, but that's not the best way for me to learn software. it's just what I like.
Yeah.
It doesn't work
Well,
as
it
well.
taps into your human desire to want to do something of value, right? And
Yeah,
the learning
totally.
becomes a part of that.
All right. So yeah, the bottom line on that one is that it has been thoroughly
Do you ever get
debunked.
pushback from the teams you work with, Mike, on
Oh, good question.
learning
Yeah.
styles?
Not on that in particular. I think people,
That's
there's
good.
probably a lot of pushback that just doesn't get verbalized.
Mike, I'll do what you say,
Like,
and they go
okay,
do
yeah,
their thing.
sure, buddy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't usually get challenged. I love being challenged because I love a good discussion and exchange of ideas. I try not to take it personally.
Mhm.
And I never assume, even though I've read the Kirshner paper, that I know everything. I'm always willing to hear somebody out. I think people disagree with me, but are probably just doing show inside.
Yeah, that'll always
Passive
happen, right?
resistance.
That'll always
Yeah,
happen.
exactly.
And I think that's why one of the
Yeah.
most important things we do as instructional designers is try and come back 6 months later and do some monitoring and evaluation,
Mhm.
right? Because people can be silently disagreeing with you, but just not doing what you like, what part of your vision.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, so we've spent a while talking about the things that we do that don't help us learn. Let's start talking about some of the things that we should be doing that do help us learn, that are based in research. And you had mentioned, I don't know if you used the term before, but you mentioned situated learning in the context of the lecture. And so can you just talk about that and why that's a valuable way to learn?
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably the thing that in my work with higher education and professional development, that I focus on the most. And that is the idea that knowledge in the abstract is just not enough. At the time of application, when you go to do something that requires knowledge, you do so in a situated context. You are in a situation, and it's not enough to know the what of the thing. You have to know the how, and you have to take cues and be able to interpret the environment to know how to respond. So I'll give you my best example of situated and even social learning. I used to think that schools didn't really know this. Then my daughter in 4th grade was on the safety patrol. And when she was on the safety patrol, interestingly, they took an entirely different approach to teaching her. Instead of sitting her down in a classroom, opening up a book and reading from the book, when a car comes to the stop sign, you extend your stop pole until instead of doing that, what they actually did was they took her out to the streets and they had her observe at the end of the previous year. So she was to be the safety patrol next year. So the last few weeks of the previous year, they just started by having her observe the actual practice of safety patrol. So the other kids who had been doing it all year were doing it, but they were watching. And then the second step of integration was hey, Leah, my daughter, tell me when you think I should blow the whistle, based on, what you've seen. So, she starts to kind of be involved in the process, the practice of this thing. And then finally, they would allow her at the very last week to actually operate the whistle and the stop flag under the guidance of an expert, so that she's not causing a 10-car pileup or
Oh my gosh.
having kids get run over. So it turns out when when learning really matters, schools actually do know how to teach you. Now, can you imagine if they had given her a multiple choice test and then sent her out to direct traffic? I mean, what do you do when Johnny and Billy run after the lights already changed?
That's funny. Yeah.
What do you do when somebody's impatient parent gets halfway through the intersection, then the light changes?
Right.
There's raw knowledge, and then there's knowledge in the context of application. And we so often traditionally glorify abstract knowledge as the best possible thing. And the reality is we always need situated knowledge. So I always encourage the use of scenario-based assessments. We do a lot of skill building courses at University of Phoenix. And one of the things that each of our courses has is a series of scenarios that are real world, that don't just ask you what's the definition of a term or which of these four things meets this category. It's, in this situation, what do you do? So I think situativity,
Well,
is
situativity. Great word.
situativity. That should,
Good Scrabble
once
word.
you see it, it's hard to unsee it. And it leads to a lot of practices that make learning more meaningful.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, and I love also just the way that the school conceived of that training, because it's the classic I do, we do, you do, but in a real life scenario, which is so much more meaningful than I describe, we describe, you describe, or something like that in a classroom or with a manual.
Right.
It sounds like a really good way to do the training. I'm sure she didn't cause a 10-car pileup.
Thank goodness.
As a result.
Because, I know my daughter. I know her attention span, and I was like, you're going to let her control traffic? You're out of your mind.
I still think one of the best education experiences I ever had was when I got my EMT license. Because it's incredibly hands-on. There's like parts of it are pretty a little boring. You have to get through a little bit of like studying for the test, but like 2/3 of it is stellar. Super hands-on, super situational. Everything is tied to like why this matters. You could think of doing a medical course of which like, all right, let's like start at the head and do all the problems with the head and then kind of walk down to the feet. And then, the last week is on problems, ankle injuries or whatever. But they like organize it really well. It was still like, for actually pure like output of learning, I think it's one of the best experiences I had.
The medical education in general has been ahead of regular education for that very purpose, because if you graduate people who don't know what they're doing, people die. Right. So that's why doctors do residencies. That's why they have simulations, and they do things. They do what Lave and Wenger called legitimate peripheral participation, LPP. They studied things like midwives and blacksmiths and sort of these trades that have existed for centuries.
Apprenticeship model.
Apprenticeships. Yeah. I mean, the best way to learn something is to do something that matters under the guise of an expert, of somebody who can help you to see how they're thinking and make their thinking explicit to you. It's more than just the what, it's the why and the how that makes you an effective practitioner and an expert. And I think that's so often missing. One of the ways that we can introduce that sort of expertise in the context of instruction is a concept called worked examples. And it was a research area developed by this fellow named Sweller. Basically, he did a bunch of research that says, if you, in the context of solving a complex problem, if you can make explicit the type of thinking that an expert has, because, when you're brand new at something, you don't look at it the same way as somebody who's an expert, by definition, right? I remember recently trying to learn to ride a dirt bike.
Cool.
And I was struggling, using every bit of my brain to try to stay upright and not break a bone. And when I was done, I got back to camp, and I was talking to a friend of mine's dad who's a mechanic, and he said, yeah, it's burning kind of lean. Didn't you hear it? And I go, no, I didn't hear it. I was holding on for dear life. When you're an expert, you know what to pay attention to and what it means. And that sort of information can be really effectively shared in an instructional context through worked examples, which is basically, step-by-step solving of a problem with sort of
Right.
this meta contextualized thinking of what am I as an expert thinking at each step of the problem is a great way to build expertise and to get more focus on the how and the why than just the what.
Yeah.
Um,
And Joe, when again back to Flatiron School, one of the things that I was so impressed by was the way that the lectures were set up in many cases as worked examples, and how just for people listening who don't know what Flatiron School is, they taught coding and data science and things like that. It's an adult career change boot camp, and I've sat through a number of those lectures when I was working there, and it was these expert programmers, to use the coding example, who would walk through how to actually live code to solve a problem that we were trying to learn about. And that was so incredibly instructive in how they thought about it and what their process was and all of that stuff. It was massively informative and helpful. And so I'm sure I've said it to you, Joe, that those lectures are just amazing. But it's such an effective way to learn as a novice. And I had that experience too when I was learning. The way that I learned how to edit
Oh, cool.
audio and video was by I was in a job where I was working with a professional audio and video editor, and I sat and I was doing the marketing, and so I would come in and sort of direct the commercials that we were doing and the recording, but he was doing all of the technical work, and I learned so
Yeah.
much. I still remember watching him do that, and it wasn't an official apprenticeship or anything, but it worked just like one, because I would go home and I would practice the stuff that I saw him do, and oh, this is how envelopes work. Oh, this is how you duck stuff in and out, music behind voice and stuff like that. It's really effective.
Yeah, it's so funny
there's
that style of
oh, go ahead,
lecture
Joe.
came up just because we didn't have enough time to prep. Like I like didn't have time to prep because we were starting a company and teaching, and so I was like, okay, I'm just going to code up this thing and
I'll just do
I'll
it
do it
live.
live and it'll be fine. And it's a terrible. It's impossible to teach anyone how to do that because you have to be so
Yeah.
comfortable at teaching and doing that you're like your brain's spinning at the same time, and it completely wrecks your energy because it's an hour and a
Yes.
half of 110% focus. But yeah, we kind
Yeah.
of stumbled across something that ended up being really great.
It worked really well.
But it's good. You don't have to prep.
You know,
And you
well,
don't have to prep.
there's a whole multi-million-dollar industry built around this in the gaming world, which is
Huh.
Twitch.
Mhm.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
of course, yeah.
why are kids, adults, people who game, why do they want to watch other people play video games? This boggled my mind. My son would sit there and watch people play
Yeah.
video games, and I'm like, bro, you have the game. Go
Just go
play
play
it.
it. Yeah.
Go play the game. No. And it's because there's this cognitive apprenticeship that happens through
Yeah.
Twitch, which is you're not only seeing in interpreting their style of play, their strategy, but you can ask them questions, and they'll often tell you, how do you configure this race car, or what kind of attachments do you have on this weapon, or whatever it might be. Observing and the interacting with somebody with expertise in the context of practice has been an effective method of learning for forever. And school, in many cases, is devoid of that practice.
So disappointing.
It is, and it's so much more fun to do stuff and talk to people who know stuff, right?
It is.
Michael, one of the things that I heard back when you were talking about situated learning was something on social learning as well, and learning from an expert, but also learning from other people. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you think about that and how you build that into the experiences that you're designing.
Absolutely. That's one of the other really missing components to formalized educational experiences. In many cases, is this social learning construct. Learning is graded individually. It's viewed as an individual sport. If you try to collaborate with somebody, particularly during a test, you're cheating. And then, you walk into the real world, and almost nothing I do is a solo sport. I'm on a team, we're solving complex problems where we all see it from different angles and we're contributing to each other's understanding. In a social environment, we interact with others to validate our thinking, to correct our thinking. And we are increasingly in a world that's complicated and that requires a group and a team effort. There's challenges, right? Let's get to the practical. There's challenges with group work in the traditional educational setting, because in a lot of cases, you've got unequal distribution of effort and talent, but that's also the real world. Like, not everybody in my work team cares the same amount. Not everyone, puts in the same amount of effort. But it's an essential component of the modern day workforce. And I think the more that we can get students working together towards a larger problem, the better we prepare them for the reality that they're going to be in. I think there's lots of benefits for that. Yes, managing it can be complicated. It takes practice. It takes structure and technique. But thinking of learning as an individual solo sport, I think, limits the experience for that learner in ways that are detrimental.
Well, and you said that it's problematic to manage. I was thinking about this as you were speaking. It feels like it takes us back to the sort of the why are we doing things the way we do in traditional education, and that the reason that it's so hard to manage in a classroom setting, and the reason that it works outside of school or in a work environment, is that in school, in traditional school, everything that you do has to be distilled down to a grade about you. But in a group setting, in a social learning context, it's not all about you. It's about how the group operates and what the group accomplishes. It's kind of like if you're in a team, like you mentioned, or in a startup, or Joe, when you guys were starting up Flatiron School, everyone was pitching in, everyone was working hard. It was a group effort, and it wasn't assessed on how well did Joe do. It was assessed on, did this company actually get students? Did this company actually survive? And then you would get individual feedback, but the whole assessment was, survival and how well the company's doing. And it feels like that's not that we want to run school like a startup exactly, but it feels like there's something in there about, I don't know, just thinking about this differently. And if you're going to embrace the real world and embrace the way that things actually work, you don't want to just grade individually.
Yeah.
You don't want to just assess individually.
Yeah, I agree.
I think part of that is having defined roles, like in the workplace.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a team effort, but you're sort of, each person's responsible for a piece of it, and you're all required for it to work well. But if one or more person doesn't do their part, it's gonna affect the final outcome and sort of be obvious where it's coming from, where the issues were. But yeah, there's just so many benefits that we really just have to find ways to manage these groups. And again, it to me boils down to interest and engagement. If you have an interesting project and it's self-organized to some degree, you have less to worry about in terms of people just not being participative or not caring. If you start with caring and there's a passion project, people are going to want to participate.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to wrap, that it all comes back to that interest and care and investment in the learning process. And if we can really accomplish that, we're going to make some really big steps forward.
Don't forget the hype lesson.
People are learning.
Very important.
And the hype. We'll come back to the hype.
Makes people care.
That's
Can't
right.
forget the hype.
Yeah, it's so simple. Yeah, it's so simple, and yet we have to go through so much to convince people that, boy, why don't we start with what they're actually interested in?
Yeah.
The whole dynamic
All
will
we need
change.
is hype.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time for this. This was really fun and just really interesting to hear your thoughts on this stuff, and also just nice to chat with a fellow learning nerd. And I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Sean and Joe as well. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, our pleasure. Okay, folks, so that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and always keep learning. Did you learn something just now? Get the full episode of Ways We Learn wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love to get your rating or review.